Welcome to the Madrona Group's 15-minute forms, where we take a form to look at a little closer for 15 minutes in hopes to gain a better understanding. Today, we're going to talk about Form 22. So what is 22AR? 22AR is a notice, and it's in conjunction with the financing contingency. As we know, with contingencies, there are usually notices that correspond with those, and the financing is no different. If we look at the financing contingency in paragraph 2, we have a box that gives us the option for the seller's notice to perform, or the second option of the automatic waiver of financing. Now, because financing is a contingency, there's an action the buyer must take in order to retain the protection, and there's an action that the seller may take if they want to ask the buyer to waive that. Looking at our financing notice for this contingency, when would we use this? If we remember, our financing contingency does survive closing unless it is waived. So if you selected box 2A for the seller's notice to perform, what you are saying as a buyer is, seller, I am going to ask you to give me an X amount of days, it defaults to 21, to get all my financing in order and to get a solid direction to close on this transaction. Now, I'm also saying by checking this box, after that 21st day, the seller has the right to ask the buyer to waive the protection of the financing contingency. This is not a conversation that's done via email. This is a conversation that's done via the Form 22R. Now, if box A is selected, a seller actually has to give that notice and the buyer needs to respond to it. So notice 22AR is the seller's notification to the buyer that they would like the buyer to waive their financing contingency. Now, this form can seem a little bit scary because it used to be called the right to terminate or something along the lines of a more aggressive approach. That form name was changed in order to reflect a better understanding of what it truly means. Now, when you select this form, the seller is asking the buyer to waive the financing contingency protection. Box 1 will be selected that says seller's notice to perform. So if you have a buyer that checked box 2A, you would give notice with a 22AR to ask the buyer to remove the financing contingency. Now, when you select the first box, it automatically puts a signature line on the second box as the seller's notice of termination. And through your transaction desk and Authentisign, you can go ahead and remove that signature if that's not your immediate intention. It gives a little bit softer approach on how to deliver this when it comes to the buyer's agent. If we had selected box 2B, there would be an automatic waiver of the financing contingency protection. Do keep in mind that if you have the appraisal provision selected, so this would be either 2A bullet point II or 2B bullet point 2, even if the financing contingency for approval is waived, it still retains the appraisal provision. That means it still needs to appraise at value with no conditions. So removing the protection of the financing contingency only just tell that seller that the buyer's financing is in order and everything is moving forward towards closing. So when would you use this? Again, let's go back to that question. If you keep in mind that financing contingency carries the buyer's protection with their financing and lending through the closing date, put yourself in both the buyer or the seller's shoes. If you're a seller, you are moving, you are making plans for your next place, you are doing a lot that actually involves time and money, and you're putting all of your trust in the buyer being able to actually do what they claim they've been able to do through the first pre-approval process. So in order to give the seller some sort of confidence, the 22AR should be used and can be used to waive the protection that the buyer may fall out due to a lender issue or a approval issue. How do we explain this to buyers when they're going through this transaction? A buyer should be aware that once they get approval for financing and they've followed all the rules of what it takes to retain this contingency, that they have the protection up to potentially a certain point in the transaction. Now, at some point towards closing, a buyer and a seller should be pretty confident in the fact that this transaction is going to close and the lending is moving forward as planned. So, if you're talking to a buyer about this, you'll want to make sure that buyer does have everything in line for that approval. Make sure the buyer knows that they should not be making any large purchases, and make sure the buyer is locked into an interest rate. Because if the buyer receives the notice to perform, and the buyer responds to waive financing, that protection will no longer be there once it's waived. Why would a seller want to do this? Sellers do go through quite a bit of transition in a transaction in order to close. If a seller is living in a home, they most likely would have rented a moving van, paid moving expenses, maybe even put a deposit on something for their next home. So a seller moving through a transaction, having a buyer with a safety net all the way through closing is a little risky. When we give the notice to perform, we want to also make sure that everybody is aware that this does remove the financing protection only, not the appraisal. If you have a seller who has not asked the buyer to waive financing, the conversation should definitely come up by the day that's listed in 2A. As an agent, your duties are to the party you represent. So, as a seller duty, on day 21, or right close to day 21, you're going to ask that seller if they would like to ask the buyer to waive their financing protection. As a buyer's agent, you want to prepare that buyer for this conversation to come. Once a buyer receives this notice, the buyer does have 5 days to respond to this notice. And at the bottom, the buyer can give notice of waiving that financing contingency by checking the bottom box that says buyer's notice of waiver financing contingency. So this is a notice that goes out to the buyer with a timeline specified, and then the buyer will respond with the waiver. Now, what happens if the buyer is not in a position to waive financing and they know there might be a hiccup and they're not comfortable signing the waiver of this? The consequence of not signing the waiver of this contingency notice is that it gives the seller the right to move on to another buyer who they may feel is more qualified to purchase their home. This is going to be something that you should be on heightened awareness, especially in a competitive market. If a seller asks a buyer to waive the financing contingency and the buyer chooses not to respond to that or not to waive it, it does leave that seller open to move on to a different buyer. The seller has the right to terminate the contract. And the seller has the right to do so by checking this middle box right here that says seller's notice of termination. Make sure that when you are explaining the financing contingency, that you go over this in enough detail and understanding so your buyers and your sellers know what happens after day 21 and why we select these boxes. Would you use it? Why would you use it? And if you put yourself in that situation with your buyer or seller, you're being a good agent by at least having this conversation with them. We want to make sure that they do know their rights as sellers and they do know their obligations as buyers. Thank you for tuning in today. And if you have any questions about the 22AR, please feel free to reach out.